Welcome, fans, to the Canadian Baseball Network podcast. We're thrilled to be joined today by Jon Morosi. Jon, how's it going?
Outstanding, Matt and Jackson. Great to be with you. Excited to talk some baseball with you. Maybe a little bit of hockey at some point, but certainly what an amazing time of year. Spring training underway, and I always feel like for those of us that grow up in snowy climates and live in snowy climates, those first photos that you see of spring training are visual evidence that we will eventually triumph over winter. And
Yes.
thus, covering spring training and talking baseball is an act of faith that I love to engage in this time of year.
For me, it's always the truck leaving Rogers Center and
That's
heading
right.
down Dunedin. So that's what it is for me. But before we get to baseball, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is you've always spoken very highly of Canada, and you've always been very pro-Canadian. I'm curious, did you have an experience when you were younger, when you came north of the border and thought, hey, these people are okay? Or, where did that kind of stir from? I know you're from Michigan, so take me through kind of your love for the country.
Yeah, Matt and Jackson, it really is that. I grew up with the idea of Canada being my neighbor, and not just my neighbor in how close we live, but truly we're in the same community. I think when you grow up in a border area, and I was born in Marquette, Michigan, so I was born up in the UP. So I was actually born on a higher line of latitude than a great many Canadians are because of how far north Marquette is. And then we ended up moving to the middle part of Michigan around Bay City. And then my parents are from Detroit, so my parents would talk to us about having visited Windsor a lot as a kid, and for them growing up. And then for us, we would take vacations to Toronto. I remember we vacation in Toronto a lot. I remember distinctly taking a family trip there right when Skydome opened, and that was right when the Tigers and Jays had a really strong rivalry in the late '80s, and just really connecting over that rivalry and those games, and understanding just what a state-of-the-art place Skydome was in those years. Then, of course, the Jays won the World Series not long after that. I remember we would ski up at Surchmont. We went up there, I think, a time or two when I was a kid. I saw Sioux Greyhounds game at the old Memorial Gardens up in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. So, and I think just this year alone, my gosh, we did a game in Ottawa during the World Juniors. Took my dad to a junior game in London. I helped out at a skills competition in Windsor. And then I went to Montreal to see the Four Nations with my wife. So I mean, I've been to Canada 4 times in the last 2 months, basically. So that by the way that's not uncommon for me. So I tend to look at the border is just that. It's a place that you pass through on the way to go see your neighbor. And so I've always appreciated the culture of Canada, the way that my family and I have been treated there, the way we've always been received so warmly, and just understanding. Certainly, I watched a lot growing up, ton of Hockey Night in Canada. Again, CBC is part of our basic cable here. So my dad forever watched Peter Mansbridge at night, and we watched our hockey on Saturday with Ron McLean hosting and Bob Cole calling games. That's just kind of when you grow up in a border area, that's how you live. And so for me, it really is that it's the relationship of your neighbor down the street, and it's been a great one. And I consider myself very fortunate to be so close to Canada, both rhetorically speaking in conversations like this, and also geographically. I had a great visit actually to the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame a couple summers ago. We've vacationed up in Grand Bend and that area. So the places that are familiar to you are largely familiar to me too. And I'm very fortunate that I've been able to grow up with a real appreciation for Canadian culture.
We'll call you an honorary Canadian for the
And
purpose
I
of.
appreciate that very much. That means the world, Matt. Thank
I've
you.
never heard such an American or a Canadian speech from an American before, so that was a first. We
Well,
appreciate
I
it.
am honored. I'm honored that you say that, and really the relationship, it certainly goes both ways. It's for me I have a great whenever you have a chance to travel, and you see how much sports mean in different contexts and how we grew up with them. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to both hockey and baseball is they're both very international in scope. And that whether it's a hockey dressing room or a baseball clubhouse, you get a lot of different perspectives from a lot of different countries. And when they throw the sweater on or they throw the jersey on, they're all one. They're all part of the same team. And I think that's a very powerful message in these times, or any time for that matter. And I think it's cool too. By the way, I mentioned where I grew up in Michigan. we've got an OHL franchise that just won the Memorial Cup, by the way, right like 20 minutes away from where I grew up. And so it just sort of speaks to the cross-border nature of how we live here in Michigan and Ontario as well. And I like to sometimes note that when the Winter Classic was played in Ann Arbor, of course, Leafs and the Red Wings, I always said that "Oh Canada," I felt was maybe even a little louder than the Star Spangled Banner, because you of course, even though the stands were evenly split, because you've got so many Red Wings fans that live London and West, and certainly Windsor is, for a long time, certainly in the 90s, was more of a Wings town than a Leafs town. Maybe it's a little more balanced now, but you just kind of understand that geography and where the border is almost, it's kind of an afterthought when you think about the whole scope of human connection.
For sure. And I'm a Leafs fan, but I'm going to leave it there. Let's talk a little Blue Jays, though. I don't think we haven't had a huge chance to talk about this, but Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Not reaching his extension, not reaching an extension by that deadline. Were you surprised by that?
I wasn't, just because of a couple reasons. Number one, you look at the number of times they had tried to get this deal done and failed. And so generally speaking, the closer you get to free agency, the harder it is to achieve that point. So I didn't think that all of a sudden there was going to be a big reversal of that. I think part of it, and I'm always careful not to criticize the Jays too much on this, is Vlad's value has fluctuated a bit. Yes, he's always had amazing talent. We know that. But there were a couple of years, and by that I mean, as in a year ago at this time, he was coming off a season where he was very average as a first baseman. And if there's one spot where you often in your lineup can afford to put together a platoon or handle things on more of a short-term basis, it often is first base. I mean, yes, he's a special hitter when he's right, but 2023, there were very, very few Jays fans, if we're being honest about this, who would have been on your podcast a year ago saying, why haven't they offered him a contract for $500 million yet? It was not being said a year ago. And then, of course, what changed? Well, his year, and then the money that Soto got changed a lot of things. And in fairness, and as I wrap up a quick point, send it back to you, Matt. In fairness, now Vladdy's looking around, and he understands this. He says, wait a minute. You got Goldschmidt on a one-year deal with the Yankees. You've got Alonso who can opt out. You've got the Red Sox who have a spot at first base, basically, because Casas is not really a long-term guy necessarily. What about the Angels? What about the Mariners if all of a sudden if they can spend some money? There are so many teams that need exactly what Vlad offers that he's looking around saying, I'm not desperate to sign this. I don't think that he is desperate enough to sign an extension that he's going to waive the right to have all of these teams demanding his services just a few months from now.
Yeah, I mean, a year ago, I remember Jackson and I having the conversation. Was Bo Bichette the guy that you would lock up?
Right. Exactly.
You've been around a lot of clubhouses in your lifetime. Is something like this and a failure to reach this deal and what Vladdy means to this franchise, can it be a distraction to the on-field product? Or is that something more of a media narrative that we like to talk more about than is actually accurate?
I'll give the answer that we always hate to hear, which is it depends. But I'll give you a little more substance to it. People forget, okay, 2011, big distraction. Albert Pujols shows up to Jupiter, Florida. Same exact thing. I'm not going to talk about an extension once I show up. He shows up, no deal. The Cardinals win the World Series. He, of course, signs with the Angels. So that didn't stop him there. It didn't hurt the Yankees. Last I checked, Juan Soto was their best player in the playoffs, and he was sitting on an expiring contract, and they went it all the way to the World Series. And if not for a fluky inning and a questionable bullpen choice in game one, they might have won the whole thing. So I think that we get a little bit carried away sometimes. If you allow it. Now, I think Max Scherzer basically said this the other day when he was announced as the Blue Jay, that winning cures everything. If you've got a good clubhouse, and the reason why it wasn't an issue for Albert and the Cardinals in 11 is they had a lot of professional dudes in that clubhouse. They had Holiday and Berkman and Chris Carpenter. And I mean, they had some guys there to make sure that it wasn't going to be a distraction. Okay. And they were winning. So it was not a problem at all. And last year, the Yankees, they were winning, and Soto was playing great and Judge was playing great. So it wasn't a problem. The Jays just have to keep winning. The more they win, the less of a story it'll be. We all know what's coming next winter. It's going to be crazy money, and all the same teams are going to be involved that are always involved. The same, you could mark it down. Same teams that were in there on Soto are the same teams that are going to be there on Vladdy in November and December and in January if it takes that long. That's just it. So for me, I would almost advise, and I know it's hard, like easy for me to say, just play out the season, enjoy it, cheer for your team. Who knows what's going to happen after the season is over? Nobody really knows. I do think it's going to be just being honest, it's going to be hard to sign him. Look at the numbers and look at what we don't know exactly dollars and cents what he turned down, but I mean, the Jays probably made him a pretty serious offer. He clearly said no. He clearly wants to test the market. The right teams are all involved with needs to sign a player like him. It's going to be really expensive, and the chances are pretty good he's probably going to be somewhere else next year, just based on the number of teams that like him. So we just have to, I think, just set that aside and realize that there are plenty of teams that have won some big championships with pending free agents right before free agency. And the Jays have to set their minds toward becoming the latest of those teams to do so.
That's going to strike a lot of emotion as Blue Jays fans, because you mentioned winning a World Series and losing Vladdy all in the same conversation. So I'm curious what the reaction that would be. I think they would probably take that trade-off, to be honest.
Sure. I think the Cardinals, and again, think about it this way. If you ask a Cardinal fan how they view the 2011 World Series, even though that it precipitated Albert's departure, they would say it was a great time. And by the way, I think if I remember correctly, they used the pick that they lost when Albert left to draft Michael Wacha, who helped them get back to the World Series 2 years later. So we're in the moment, and it's all about Vlad right now, but there is a continuum here. And I think that the other piece of this thing is, we talked about this, you mentioned it, Matt, a minute ago. What happens if Bo all of a sudden comes up and has a phenomenal year? And then he becomes the guy that you want to sign? Because in general, if you've got a shortstop and you've got or just a middle infielder, let's say, but hopefully you can stay shortstop, and then a first baseman, you're probably more likely going to sign the shortstop if you can, because that's just a position of greater need and demand. So I think that the Jays, while it's a very complicated time, I get it. They've shored up their defense by bringing in Jimenez, who I think is a phenomenal complementary player. And as much as we get into different things here, I think Jimenez has a chance to be the real X factor for this team, because if he can somehow bat second and do so in a credible, solid way, then that allows you to do a whole bunch of things with all the other spots in your lineup. Then if Bo is hitting, or Santander, depending on where you want to go with guys, if Jimenez can bat second, then you maybe go Vlad, Santander, and Bichette in some order there in the next three. Ideal if Springer can bat leadoff and stay healthy. It just opens up a lot of options for you. So that's why Jimenez, for me, I know he's been an inconsistent bat at times, but I just think he's a very smart player, and I'm a believer in what he can bring to a team.
Time now for a mound visit, courtesy of the Baseball Zone. Today, Coach Sean Schaefer discusses the most common challenge that a high school pitcher faces.
Yeah, so my biggest thing about high school pitchers is just chasing velocity. A lot of high school, you see the major leagues and everyone's throwing mid to upper 90s into 100 miles an hour. Development isn't always on a straight line. So we need to understand that there's going to be velocity peaks, but then there's also going to be velocity valleys as well. But I think from a pitching development side of things, they need to understand that throwing strikes at a high intent is just as important as throwing hard. We know that hitters fail a lot of the time, so using the big part of the plate early on in counts will help them succeed. And know that, as much as you can use your defense behind you, understand that, sometimes mistakes can happen, but control what you can control. So if you're throwing strikes, you're doing your job, and hopefully the players behind you can do their jobs as well.
This has been a mound visit courtesy of the Baseball Zone. Now back to the action.
Back to Bichette for a minute, because I want to get your perception. And a perception, the reason for that is you're outside the market. A lot of people are really down on Bichette. I personally believe he's the guy that was pre-2024. How is he seen industry-wide coming off this last season?
Well, I mean, I think he's got a lot to prove. There's no question about that. And whether it was injury and consistency, last year just never got off the ground for him. And I just think that he does have to prove some things here in 2025. The good news is that he realizes what's at stake. The team realizes what's at stake. I mean, it's mutually beneficial that everybody move towards the way of getting Bo as healthy as he can be and be as productive as he can be, because it helps him individually, his bottom line, and also it helps the team. I still think there is a good bat in there. The notion that he's the player that he was last year, objectively, Matt and Jackson, he was one of the worst players in baseball last year based on batting average. And that's not him. That's not who he is. He had a really bad year. He's not a bad player. He had a bad year. That's how I look at him. And so if he even gets back to being 75, 80% of the player that he was in the past, that's more than enough to hold down a significant spot in this Jays lineup. So I think he's due to bounce back, at least in a moderate way. And that's a very low bar. And if he can just do that, he gives protection for Vladdy or protection for Santander, or he's on base when they're coming up. There's a lot of different ways that they can do this, but it just starts with him having a good solid year. And I think he's due for that. By all accounts, physically, he looks good. I know John Schneider's been very complimentary of the shape he has come in and the mentality that he's brought. But this is now up to Bo. I mean, he's been someone that we've talked about with high potential and everything else. This is now his ship. And if he wants to be looked upon as a superstar, he has got 7 months to prove it. And that's the next 7 months will go a lot towards determining what his career will become in the years ahead.
Well, I'm going to throw a contract comparison at you, and this is based on him bouncing all the way back. Is he that far off from a Willy Adames type deal, 182 over 7? And not quite the power necessarily that Adames has, but that's about $26 million a year. And I'm talking the guy from 2022, 2023.
Right. He would have to be back to that level, in my estimation, for him to get a deal of that caliber. I think Adames has shown it more year after year that he's that kind of a guy. And I think when you're giving out a contract like that with that type of AAV and that number of years, you got to be really sure of the person and the player that you're getting. So I think that, could he get there? Yes. I think he more likely it would maybe come down a little bit south of that, but he's still got the numbers that we're talking about here. The question is, I would look at it as, does he have a good chance to get a 9-figure deal? And I really believe he does. He's just got to stay healthy and hit like he's always hit. This dude was one of the hits leaders in the American League year over year. He's just got to do something like that again, and he'll get paid in a huge way. I mean, whether it's, depending on what the AAV is it low 20s, whatever it might be. But I think his numbers probably come in a little bit below Adames, but if he stays healthy and productive, not by too much.
Yeah, I threw that as the bar because obviously that was the big deal of the offseason for stops. Let's talk a little bit about the offseason more generally. Is it, personally for me, it can be a bit of a slog following the baseball offseason. How does it feel covering it? And does it seem like it's very slow developing compared to other sports, or is that just me?
It is certainly slow developing. I think that the biggest reason is, of course, the lack of a cap. And so there's not the frenzy, which when we're following the news on Canada Day for free agency, and it's fast and furious and everything's
That's where I was going.
5 o'clock.
That's where I was going.
and they're up at the Muskoka Lakes by 5 o'clock. You know, like that's so that it's different. Then we'd be done by the middle of November, and what would we do for 4 months? So I actually think I enjoy it. I do. At times it can get a little bit tedious. You're right. But I enjoy that we have different phases and seasons to talk about different players, and that it certainly, if I'm saying from a network standpoint, there's news that goes right up until pitchers and catchers reporting. So I've got no complaints with the way that the news cycle works, because it keeps us busy and gives us things to talk about. Again, do I wish sometimes that the process was a little less secretive, that we had a little more insight into the journey and how it ends up going? Sure. But that's just the way it goes. And I respect these are major decisions made by families and teams and agents, and I get it. It's sensitive, and you know, we all have jobs to do. We're trying to be as accurate and entertaining as we can be, obviously on the air every day, and the players are trying to make the right decisions for their families. So I respect all of it, and it does. So I guess if I could change baseball offseason, practices. I really wouldn't. I think we're actually pretty good the way that it is. I know it's a long wait for the players, but and again, there are some really good guys like Kyle Gibson, Anthony Rizzo, still unsigned, well into spring training. So that part is not good. But I think that the general excitement level, I think, it keeps us very much engaged all the way through the wintertime.
I got one for you here, quick, John. The AL East this year, your overall impressions of it. Boston had a solid offseason, added some big pieces. There seemed to be an ascendant club. Just kind of your thoughts here in spring training about the AL East and who you got, kind of leading the pack.
Sure. I think Boston, we'll see how things get sorted out with this Bregman and Devers situation. That has the potential to be a real controversy for a long time when you've got one of your highest paid players who doesn't like his assignment. And this is not a market that is exactly a one newspaper town in Boston. There's going to be a lot of commentary about this. There's a couple all sports radio stations that will be talking about the Red Sox lineup on February 25th and on October 25th and every day in between. So I think that if they find a way to navigate that, then I really like Boston's chances. I think Walker Buehler coming in there is a tremendous fit. The Crochet trade, the way that they've got some young players ready to really contribute. Campbell is a big name. Anthony's a big name. Meyer's a big name. I mean, they've got some talent there. So I like them. The Yankees, I'm a little worried. I think the Bellinger move was great. Fried, phenomenal. I think Goldschmidt was really good too. I worry, and obviously Williams for the bullpen. The Stanton thing, though, is worrisome to me, and it's already this early in the season. He's got some bilateral elbow issues. He was a really important player for them to get to the World Series last year. So I worry about that. I think the Rays, from my perspective, they'll be better, a little bit better. They're a little healthier right now in their rotation. They're able to trade someone like Springs because they felt confident what was coming up behind him. So I think as they get a little more athletic and bring some guys back, I think they'll be a better team. I don't think they're as good as the Jays or the other teams I mentioned. I think Baltimore is excellent, obviously, with their young talent. I think Jackson Holiday will take a big step. I worry a bit about their rotation. This is honestly as wide open as the American League East has been for me. I might give the slight edge to Boston at the top, but I don't think anybody's far off of that. I really don't. I think this is a very, very closely matched race. And if Baltimore decides to make a move, they already brought in Charlie Morton. I think it's a really good move. Sugano, I think, has a good chance to contribute. If they make a move for a starter, and they can because they've got really good prospects, I think Baltimore's got a really good chance to repeat even without Corbin Burns in the rotation this year.
I got two more questions for you. One, do the Jays make the playoffs?
I think they fall just short. I think they'll be in the conversation for the full 6 months. Meaningful games in September, yes. I just think that there's a little bit more in the tank for the other teams in the league. So I've got them. I have not exactly sketched out how I've got everybody finishing, but I'm feeling like they're a respectable but out of the playoffs third place.
Exactly what Blue Jays fans want to hear.
Sorry, I promised you honesty, Matt and Jackson, when we started the conversation. I'm giving you what I got.
That's all I want. So I always ask people, I find it interesting how they get their start in this business, in this industry. And I was reading up a little bit on you. You started at the Detroit Free Press. Is that right?
I did. Yep. So I grew up in Michigan, went to university out in Boston. Actually, I covered hockey there before I covered baseball. So hockey was the first thing I covered. ECAC college hockey back in the day. It was been Harvard, Cornell, Yale, all those different schools out there. It was a great time. Had a lot of fun. So I covered hockey first, and I came back and got my dream job covering the Tigers for my hometown paper in Detroit. And then went from there. Learned a lot from John Lowe, learned a lot from Ken Rosenthal once I went over to foxsports.com. So it's interesting. I do a lot of TV work now. When I first started doing TV, I was terrified by it. It just something about being on the air and not having a backspace key just was really anxiety producing for me. And it took me a long time before I was able to feel comfortable and be myself. And so I think that that's probably the advice that I would give to young people who want to do this is to give yourself the time and space to pursue the angles of what it is that you want to cover if you want to be a journalist, and learn the technical parts of it, learn the broadcasting parts, learn the writing part. I try to sort of keep all those muscles going, if that makes any sense. I don't write as much as I used to, but I still enjoy doing it. I actually write a little bit of hockey now, which is kind of fun. I get to do some features for NHL.com, which I really enjoy. So I think my advice to people is to hang around as long as you can and learning different entry points to the business, and also to not be too shaped by difficult things that you go through, whether it's when you're first coming up or when you're older. In my career, like with Ohtani last offseason, you can't let yourself get too pulled down by the struggles, because much like the players on the field, we're going to have the ups and downs. That's a part of life and a part of the business. And just think if I had at the outset of things, when I got really anxious doing TV, if I had said, oh, I can never do it, and if I had kind of put up that wall and just said, I'm not comfortable going there, then I wouldn't have been able to see the things I've been able to see. So I just try to remind people to not be too shaped by the negative. Learn from it, lean into that part and say, yeah, that was tough, and I learned something really valuable, but then to get up the next day and keep going. Because when you look at the end of the day, just like any player on the field or on the ice, whatever we all do in life, we're shaped by the lessons that we pick up when we fail. I think much more so than when we succeed. And the hope is that by the end of that, you're a little better off and a little sharper in what you do, and you're a little broader of a storyteller than you were the previous day. Especially this. I mean, think about this, Matt and Jackson. We get to talk about sports and things we love, and that's part of what we do for our living. So I just think it's a blessing to do this, and I've had a lot of great mentors that have shown me the way. And just as long as we, in the midst of even there's days that are not glamorous, there's the 5 a.m. flights, I get all that stuff, but we're doing something that we love, and I think as long as we keep that in our mind, we'll never go wrong.
Yeah, I always try to tell myself I'm not doing brain surgery here. I'm talking about
That's
faith.
Right. Exactly right. We gotta keep that in. I mean, like, my wife works in healthcare, so like what she's doing every day, is way more important than what I do. I care about what I do deeply, and I love what I do. But I also, when I come home at night, I try to remember, okay, John, you're worried about, if who's going to pitch the 7th inning for the Blue Jays. It's not quite the same thing that she's doing at work. So trying to have that perspective is important.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and I think it's a great way to end this conversation. John, we really appreciate you taking the time today.
Matt and Jackson, my pleasure. Give my best to Bob as well, and an honor to be part of the show. And hopefully we'll see you in Ontario at multiple times during the course of this year.
Another great guest, not Canadian, but I would say an honorary Canadian, as I mentioned, Jackson Jon Morosi, loves the country of Canada, and had a lot of great insight on the Blue Jays.
Almost Canadian, Matt. Yeah, really nice to chat with him. He's got a lot of appreciation for hockey in this country. He's covered hockey. He mentioned it. Yeah, really, really nice to chat with him. A guy who has, been around the game of baseball for a while, and, you grow up watching him, whether it be with Fox or whoever, and covering big time events. So it's good to chat with him. He brought a lot of wisdom, and yeah, really, really good to meet him and have a good conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and just for him to give us that much of his time to sit down and talk a little baseball. He mentioned the 2011 St. Louis Cardinals, which, if that's the way this Blue Jay season ends, I think every Blue Jay fan signs up for that.
That's a good poll. It's a really interesting comparison too. I was thinking about it in the vein of like that Pujols contract did not age well with the Angels, right? Like, yes, he broke numerous records and he climbed the leaderboards while wearing an Angels jersey, but I mean, you would remember, Matt, like those were some dark days out there. Those Angels games where it was Pujols and Trout in that lineup, and that was it. Pujols didn't look so good. So it's something to keep in mind here as we talk about the Vladdy extension and how much money he is asking for.
And they signed C.J. Wilson that same offseason, which was supposed to be the big left-handed pitcher in the rotation, and it just never came together for the Angels. So there's more than one way to do it, to build a roster. I know a lot of Jays fans may not have the trust in Atkins and Shapiro to do it, but I guess time will tell. That's a wrap on another episode of the Canadian Baseball Network podcast, but we got a lot of good guests coming up. Our old friend Keegan Matheson is going to be on to discuss his book, but until then, take care.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out Canadian Baseball Network for extensive and comprehensive coverage of the latest in Canadian baseball. And The Baseball Zone, Canada's leading instructional baseball academy and training home to thousands of MLB pro, college, and youth baseball players.